and thank you so much to the Federation for organizing this and for inviting Mexico to give us the opportunity to share the vision, if you like, of the Mexican presidency of the G20. Perhaps the first point I should stress is the political philosophy or vision of President Calderón in chairing the G20, where we think the G20 should go, what is the role of the G20 according to ourselves. And there it is useful to say, and this will explain why we are giving so much importance to food security, that we believe that the G20's role should not be limited only to financial issues, should not be limited only to the financial crisis as such, and should not be limited only to fixing the international financial institutions. Those issues clearly are in the heart of the G20, and those issues clearly need to be solved. But from the perspective of Mexico, what we have to deal with, and these issues I mentioned are only components to, is the real economy of the world, or the world's real economy. For us to debate or to discuss how we should stabilize the economy, how we should produce or promote structural reforms to stabilize the economy, has to be based, has to be aimed, or has to be focused on the real economy. The real economy that fosters growth and creates jobs or employments. That's what this is about. And in doing that, Mexico is a developing country, and we believe that the G20 has to be as well about developing countries' needs, developmental issues and challenges. And this is why, amongst other things, we are thinking and we are trying to foster the idea that the G20 has to work on the real economy. If you see the 5 Mexican priorities for the G20, you will see that the 4th is precisely, as you quite rightly mentioned, food security and commodity prices. Commodity prices or food security linked to commodity prices has been in the agenda since Seoul. And the focus then was basically the question of prices and instability of prices and the rise in food prices within the context of commodity prices. Then during the French presidency, the focus was expanded to food security vis-à-vis the then terrible food crisis, mainly in the Horn of Africa, and a lot of work was then done in order to try to address that very specific situation. And then, carrying from there, the Mexican presidency is also expanding the notion and the scope of food security as well, not only to food prices to food prices or specific food crisis in some specific regions. In this case, it was the Horn of Africa, but to the whole idea of development. Food is one of the major causes, food prices, food insecurity, not food security, is one of the major causes for the creation of or affecting poor people, or creating even poor people, more poor people around the world. According to some estimates, different figures, around 1 billion people around the world have to spend at least 50% of their income in food. And every time food increases, these numbers become even worse, clearly creating poverty around the world. According to trends as well, by 2050, if we want to achieve sustainable levels of food supply that is enough for then world population, we will have to increase food production in about 80%. And this increase of food will have to take place basically, if not exclusively, in developing countries. So this is the logic, the philosophy, the vision, the mindset, or the facts that the Mexican presidency is keeping in mind when addressing this fourth priority that deals with food security and commodity prices. One extremely important fact that we also keep in mind and that we are trying to and we have to address as regards prices, and let me stay a little bit just quickly on the financial side of this equation before I go into the development one, which is the one that really matters most for us, is that commodity prices are not, data suggests, are not the pure reflection of offer demand and growing demand, which is true, there is growing demand around the world, but that is not the only reason why food prices have been on the rise from the last few years, and not only on the rise, but in a very unstable and unpredictable way. And the reason that we see is really causing this factor is pure speculation. Not so long ago, perhaps 10, 20 years ago, food markets were basically controlled by food companies, food producers, and perhaps 10%, maybe 20% of the food market was controlled or had the involvement of financial entities or financial institutions participating in the food market. Now data suggests that that equation is now exactly the opposite one, which is around 80% of the food market is being controlled by financial institutions selling futures, for example, on food, and no more than 20%, and perhaps that's even higher, it's too high, by food companies. So there is a whole area of work where the G20 members are working and trying to address through different mechanisms, including a mechanism to monitor food prices. Now, on the developmental or development side of this equation, as I said, is the most challenging and it is the most important for us because, again, the G20 has to deal with poverty, has to deal with economic growth, has to deal with human development, and that's the only way we can ensure a world based on sustainable development, which is also an overarching priority of the Mexican presidency, sustainable growth and sustainable development, which means not only that it's sustainable, but also creates jobs, creates good living conditions, or fosters the increased or the strengthening of living conditions. So to do that, if you want me to use another general term that reflects what we are trying to do within the G20, perhaps the right term would be another green revolution. Another green revolution that would create the right conditions for technologies, knowledge, credits, finance, and so on and so forth, reaching small producers, reaching small producers in rural communities, reaching family units or family production units, or production units of one person in rural communities or in small communities. That's where we have to foster, that's where we have to strengthen agriculture and food production. So in order for us to do that, and one term that, by the way, President Calderon has been using on that, apart from or complementing a green revolution, is democratization of knowledge. The idea is to bridge the gap between big food producers and really small rural producers. They are far, far, far from having access to the tools, the knowledge, the financial resources they need, so they are able to produce. Now, in order for us to push this process forward, we have asked through the so-called development working group. The development working group was established in Seoul during the G20 meeting there, and it was created as a means to monitor implementation of the so-called multi-annual development plan. This working group obviously is working in is following that mandate, implementing that multi-annual or multi-year development plan, but it is also working on the Mexican emphasis to this question of global food security, which are green economy, sustainable development, development of infrastructure for sustainable development, and so on and so forth. So through this working group, we have asked a conglomerate of international organizations, including naturally FAO, the World Bank, the IMF, OECD, and so on and so forth, even, by the way, non-governmental institutions, to produce a report, comprehensive report, on measures to be taken, challenges to be addressed, and then measures to be taken in order for us to realize this idea, this desire of a green revolution. Again, a new green revolution. Again, meaning how can we pool all these resources, how can we create all the right conditions for the ultimate or the end smaller producers to have access to them and then strengthen their ability to produce. Finally, because time is short, we have created together with around the G20 several mechanisms or bodies that are producing reflection, knowledge, experience gathering, so all these can reach the leaders in June. One of these tools or bodies or mechanisms that has been working throughout the different G20 summits is the so-called, as you know, B20, which is Business 20, which has the role of following the presidency's priorities and agenda of the G20 and producing from their own very business-oriented perspective, producing suggestions, recommendations, and again, simply reflection and thinking. There is also another 2 or 3 created by the Mexican presidency. One is Youth 20, and the other is Think 20. So these 2 plus Business 20 plus Labor 20, which is a mechanism for workers' unions to participate in the process. All of them are also focusing on food security as a cross-cutting issue that has to be dealt with, has to be seen from their respective angles. For example, Business 20, they met in Mexico, in Puerto Vallarta, within the framework of the Regional World Economic Forum that took place a couple of months ago, no, last month actually, and then they met, they are divided in task forces according to each one per priority, and there's one task force on food security. So they, business leaders from the food sector met around the table amongst themselves, and then they discussed this huge challenge on food security and began to produce some reports and ideas that need to be obviously refined. They're still meeting. And the same applies to the other mechanisms, Youth 20, Think 20, and Labor 20. So that by the summit, Leaders Summit in mid-June next month, we will have a huge stream of ideas, knowledge, and the idea is that all of these come in a very well organized, systematized way, so really leaders can deal with them and make sensible decisions towards this issue. Just one last comment, two last comments very quickly. In these systems, I should have mentioned, obviously, the question of NGOs, civil society. We have opened many channels for civil society to participate in a very real, meaningful way, and this is happening in all of the Mexican priorities. And finally, as a political message, if you like, from the Mexican government as chair of the G20, is that the Mexican government do not believe that the G20 is a tool to replace multilateral institutions, but rather is exactly the opposite. Is a mechanism, is an ad hoc mechanism that, amongst other things, should serve the purpose of strengthening multilateral diplomacy, strengthening multilateral institutionalized diplomacy, and therefore it should also strengthen governance or solve the real challenges that we are facing because of, in some cases, lack of governance. And this is critical not only in abstract terms, but very clear in very real issues like food security. Thank you so much for giving me this time, and we are very happy to listen to your questions. Thank you so much.